Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on the Breaking the Silence podcast. I am your host, Sean McBride at Addiction Rehab Toronto. I'm joined here today by Alexandra Canzonieri. She's an MA, an RP, a CCC, and just a general advocate for mental well-being. Alex, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Yeah, of course. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So today we're going to be talking to Alex about some issues and some concerns that probably affect more people than what they're probably aware of. Mainly the source of shame, tied in with regret, tied in with self-image. So Alex, let's just start at the start. What exactly do you do in your practice, and how long have you been doing it?
Yeah, so as an RP, I work a lot with anyone who's coming in with mental health issues. I don't want to say I specialize, but I definitely have a passion working with people who've experienced trauma, so complex trauma. And I've done this probably since I was in my practicum. I've worked with women survivors of child sexual abuse, and then, working in the area of addiction, children and family mental health as well. And then opening up my practice, what I wanted to do is really expand that. So I wanted to create a team that's also trauma focused. And it's become this very collaborative culture here where we're able to learn from each other's expertise. Each person really comes in with, their own specialty. So, we have someone who works with children and parents. We have another one who does a lot of the trauma work with adults. So we really work with every age group and everyone in the family. And we use a lot of different modalities to address trauma. So EMDR is a big one, DBT, internal family systems therapy, emotion focused therapy as well. And I like to take from these different approaches and kind of integrate them to find the best kind of fit for each client.
That's fantastic. So you have kind of a holistic approach, like whatever fits best.
Yes.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
You said you deal with every age group. Shame, do you find it something that kind of evolves over time? Like people who are older, like past the teenage group, are kind of more, the shame has kind of developed a deeper root? Or do you find that in teens and younger people, it's more prevalent?
Yeah. So I think that shame is a bit of an insidious emotion in that it's not something that we're conscious of. It doesn't just kind of develop this idea that I think I'm a bad person. Oftentimes it comes from developmental trauma, which means that it's typically, in childhood or teenage years, and it's during those more sensitive or critical periods of our life. Mm-hmm. And what tends to happen is that over time, let's say when a child has experienced trauma, the helplessness of that child, they don't really know what to do about it, right? Like they're in a situation that's unsafe, but they also can't leave that situation because they're dependent on the people taking care of them. So they develop certain mechanisms in order to try to make sense of the trauma. And that's one of the ways that shame can develop, right? When I start to think that I'm a bad person, I deserve to be punished, I reclaim control of the narrative. So now it makes sense as to why I'm experiencing this or people are treating me this way, right? And so then we start to carry that throughout our life. Now that can be a more extreme example of trauma, but it could also be kind of day-to-day things like, someone who, let's say, struggles with ADHD, undiagnosed as a child, they realize maybe they're not getting the same grades as other peers, or they're taking longer to do things. And maybe they're told a lot of, or given a lot of criticism. So they start to internalize that idea of oh, I'm dumb, I'm not smart enough, right? It becomes about who I am as a person fundamentally and not other factors that could be affecting my behaviors.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess that inner narrative, if it's not addressed and dealt with and resolved, that can become really detrimental. Yeah. I had a question kind of about the difference between shame and guilt. Do you see them as symbiotic, or do you see them as two separate emotions?
I think they work in tandem. I will say too, I always want to preface this that no emotions are bad either, right? And so I don't want to villainize shame, but why it can feel so profound is because the difference is that guilt is, let's say, more focused on the behavior, whereas shame is focused more so on the person. So with guilt, or if I'm feeling guilty, it's because I think, oh, I did something wrong. I've hurt someone. Let me try to rectify that. So I might apologize for my behavior. Whereas
Right.
shame, if I do something that I believe is wrong, rather than seeing it as, oh, I did this thing and let me try to resolve it, it's
Mhm.
I did that because I'm bad or because I'm dumb or whatever other narrative that it's almost kind of like that behavior defines me as a person, which is why it's also harder to untangle that emotion, right? And understand,
Mhm.
okay, or try to reframe that kind of inner narrative.
No, that makes a lot of sense. No, thanks personally for even separating those two, because I know for myself and a lot of people, they can be kind of indistinguishable.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned EMDR, which is something I've always found really fascinating,
Mm-hmm.
but lesser known. It's one of the lesser known. CBT, DBT, they're pretty mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go a little bit into what EMDR is and who would be kind of a suitable candidate for it?
Yeah. So what I like about EMDR is that unlike those other approaches that you mentioned, CBT, DBT, that tend to be more kind of um, it's more like talk therapy, superficial in the sense that what we're doing is we're dealing with the issue at hand. So let's say something happens during the week. What we're doing is we want to reframe that thought process associated with whatever happened. Whereas EMDR, we're really getting to the root of the issue, right? So we're getting beyond the superficial here. And what it does is I think this is the key part of EMDR. It incorporates bilateral stimulation. So bilateral stimulation can take several forms. OGMDR is more like the fingers you're moving back and forth, but now
Right.
it can also be, tapping. It could be something more tactile. It could be auditory, just as long as it's alternating from left to right. And the whole theory behind that is if you're doing that while you're reprocessing memories, it's similar to like when we're in REM sleep and we're consolidating our memories. In REM sleep, our eyes are going back and forth, and that's the best way for us to consolidate information from days prior. So EMDR, by the way, you're fully conscious. It's not like hypnosis, right? So you're very present in the session, but by pairing the reprocessing with that bilateral stimulation, the hope is that it can reprocess whatever memory is stuck in the system that's been maladaptively processed and become a
Mhm.
more adaptive memory. So it's not about eliminating the memory. It's more about becoming desensitized to it. And that's literally in the name, right? EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing.
Awesome. So it's almost like making the memory more palatable versus reformatting it completely. That makes a
Totally.
lot of sense.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you,
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
do you find that there's any other modalities that are that direct, or like you said, is it mostly talk therapy?
I think that I think a big part of trauma therapy is that it can't just incorporate just the cognitive portion of things. It has to incorporate also emotional processing as well,
Mhm.
right? Which is oftentimes what CBT can fail to do, or DBT, because these are more kind of like you're using coping mechanisms, you're learning different things again to deal with the issue in the moment, and that can be really powerful. But
Yeah.
oftentimes I think what happens is that by the time people come to me and they want to do EMDR, they're already so talked out. They can talk about their trauma very factually, almost to the point where you see no emotion in them. And they're
Yeah.
like, yeah, but I'm still feeling the effects of it in my nervous system. It still comes out as flashbacks, or, I still have a lot of anger, or I'm still feeling really anxious, or I feel the chronic pain. And so that's why I think EMDR is different from those. That being said, though, it's not the only form of trauma treatment, and it's not going to work for everyone either.
For
I
sure.
personally believe that anything that incorporates even the body can be really powerful as well. So any kind of like sensorimotor psychotherapy, emotion focused therapy too, it really gets to the emotional part of things, and it tries to actually really bypass the cognitive stuff, and that could be a good way of processing as well. So I do incorporate that into EMDR. The nice thing is, even though EMDR is highly structured, we don't just
Mhm.
dive into the reprocessing. We always have to do a bit of groundwork beforehand, and that's where you can incorporate all these other modalities. CBT might be part of that. EFT, internal family systems therapy, that's also a really powerful approach for therapy as well, as you get to know your parts that have developed from trauma. So I think there's a lot of different things that you can use, but again, it's really up to the client and what resonates for them.
Sure. Now, I know obviously you deal with a wide range of patients with a lot of different, conflicts and a lot of different age groups. Is there one that you find most? Like, do you deal with people specifically that, you would find they have, addiction recovery or childhood trauma or, psychosis of some kind?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think it's really important to assess like where a client is at. And I always do that, even with the EMDR, like that is not suitable for everyone. I would not, if someone is in like active psychosis, I would even be mindful about doing any kind of psychotherapy until that's like medically managed.
For
So you really
sure.
got to know your audience beforehand and also how vulnerable people are. Like you said, even when it comes to clients dealing with addiction, depends where they're at in their, are they in active addiction? Where are they at in their recovery? Are they ready to take on trauma therapy? Because that's the other thing too. Like I have a lot of clients that'll come in and they want to do EMDR because they hear it's this like life-changing thing. And I want to be very clear that it's actually very intensive treatment too. Like it can be very helpful, but it is a commitment, right? You have to commit to weekly, bi-weekly sessions. It gets very intense. You really have to like feel the worst of it before it can get better.
For
And so
sure.
unless I can, with absolute certainty, say that that client is in a pretty like safe and secure place, like they're not dealing with anything that could be I don't know, keeping them in danger, then
Yeah.
yeah, that's when I would kind of decide, okay, is it the right time to do EMDR, or can we do other things to kind of first off lay the groundwork, get those grounding strategies in check. Maybe it's a bit of case management too to make sure other things in their environment are stable.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, and I could definitely see how, it'd be really triggering because you really have to dive into it before you can start rewiring those neural pathways. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
For people that are, experiencing shame and, are kind of feeling that shame spiral, any like, quick pointers or any tips you could give them to, other than obviously going to your website and, booking time with you, anything that you could kind of give them to kind of have hope, so to speak?
Yeah, I think of shame as such a vulnerable emotion that doesn't want to be seen. And it reminds me so much of like a child. So when we start to see shame as, this part of us that is so, it's like underdeveloped, it's, a helpless child rather than, this emotion that's out to get us and we hate it. And, it creates all this conflict with that emotion.
Yeah.
We can even start to connect to our own younger self. And this is more like inner child work, that anyone can do this, right? The moment we feel shame, where does that take you back to? And just reflect on that memory for a moment. See if you can connect with that young part of yourself. Observe it. Be curious with that part. What's going on there, right? I see that you're crying when you were getting bullied in that way. And so let me see if I can just give myself a bit of self-compassion, right? And if it's hard to do that in the moment to yourself, what would you say to a child who's crying and going through that? Maybe that's a little bit more palatable to be able to do that, right? So again, that takes work, but I think self-compassion is really the kind of key to being able to fundamentally change those core beliefs about ourselves as not being a good enough person.
Awesome. And I know it's really hard to assess, but would you say, like in your practice, that you've actually witnessed that metamorphosis from someone who comes in, riddled with shame to a person who's self-accepting, self-loving, or is it just such a slow process?
Yeah, I've seen it, and it is slow because we're talking about, again, this kind of like it's developmental, so many different experiences that person has had that confirm that self-criticism or that narrative that, is so established now in adulthood. So it does take time, but I've seen it, and it's been such a beautiful thing to see people in action. Again, it's not about like not feeling these emotions. It's how do we manage it? How do we learn to maybe not see them as burdens? And that way we start to unburden ourselves. We start to feel more compassionate towards ourselves, even if, we're not meeting certain expectations that we have for ourselves, rather than seeing it as, oh, because I'm not good enough. I know that I didn't do this because, there were other factors outside of who I am as a person. And that's been a beautiful transformation to see.
Awesome. And as you know, I'm actually in an active recovery myself. My coworker told me probably about 2 or 3 hours ago that I'm my own worst self-critic. And, there's so many people out there that critique themselves to death and just pick on themselves. So I guess basically, does all of that necessarily stem from some trauma, or are there some people that you think are just hardwired to be harder on themselves than others?
It's a good question. My belief is that there's a learned behavior associated with that. And it could be very subtle. Like over time, maybe those kind of judgments were perceived in a certain way. We've internalized them to take that shape of, self-criticism. And then with time, all these other things that are happening in that person's life start to confirm that narrative over and over and over again. I don't think that, kids are born with that idea that they're bad. I think that's learned. I think that's something that hasn't been maybe identified or corrected at a young age. And so that kind of belief has only blossomed as they grow.
That's really insightful. Yeah. So I always wonder that, it's the classic nature versus nurture, right? How much of that is already inside the person versus how much they grow around that too. Can the opposite be true too? Like, can there be stimuli where someone's being told externally, they're no good and to devalue themselves, but they just push through anyway? Or is that kind of too much of an existential question?
No, I think that's also a really good point, because at that point we're talking about resilience, right? And there are a lot of factors when it comes to resilience. For example, even just like someone's baseline optimism, right? Some people are actually naturally more optimistic. So maybe they start to perceive certain experiences they had in their life as more of like challenges. It also depends on that person's social network. Did they have the support they needed to get through some pretty tough challenges in their life as well? Right. And so how many challenges did that person have in their life, or how many traumas in their life? How old were they when that happened? Because that also speaks to, where they were in their development as well. Yeah.
Several years ago, I read a book that was actually called Grit. And it was written by someone who was they were a sports coach for a college team for basketball. And then they turned into a sports psychologist. And they said, grit, and he was analyzing whether grit was something you're just born with or something that you have to develop over time. And he differentiated it from resilience in the sense that grit is the person needs to be kind of put against the wall for that dig in to come out, versus resilience, which can show even in the slightest adversity. And I always thought it was a wonderful distinction, but ultimately, sorry?
Can I even just add to that? Because I think that's so fascinating.
I was just about to ask you what your take on it was. Yeah.
I'm like, even the idea of what trauma is, right? I think it's something, a word that we throw around a lot, but just because we've experienced tough challenges in our life, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were traumas, right? So the trauma is when we experience something and our nervous system hasn't been able to fully process that, and so it keeps showing up over and over and over again, and that is our system's way of trying to deal with it, but it's being dealt with in a maladaptive way, versus some people can experience some horrific things, but it doesn't develop into trauma. It's something that happens, and maybe they have that grit or that resilience where they're able to overcome that adversity and be totally okay later on.
So it's kind of like the difference between, banging your head and being okay versus banging your head and getting a concussion, essentially, right?
Yes, totally. Yeah.
Let me ask you something, because me from, off camera, I'm big into neuroscience. Do you find that, or do you think that trauma is primarily the physiological overload leads an imprint, or do you think it's an actual synaptic misfiring that permanently kind of skews something in the brain?
Oh, that's interesting. I see it as, actually, I'd be curious to hear your part, your opinion on that, if that's something that you read, because I don't know what the chicken and the egg kind of scenario.
I am no doctor or scientist. And I mean, there's a lot of schools of thought, right? Some say that, on a psychological level, that flood of cortisol, that, fight or flight, is something that leaves a permanent imprint. And other people say, it can be physiological, that your cells actually hold on to it. And then you get into, epigenetics and whatnot.
Yeah.
So no, I just wanted to see, what you thought, from your perspective, if you think it's all just from, your perception and then feeling, or if you think that it's more deep, like neural science, kind of like an impact on the brain itself.
Yeah, I definitely think there's the two sides to it. Like you said, the epigenetics, where our environment is physically changing things on a cellular level, right?
Mhm.
I think the other piece too is it's important to recognize that trauma doesn't happen from the act itself. It's what happens after and how your body deals with it. So we
That
do
makes
know
sense.
like prolonged exposure to cortisol that does start to change our body in a lot of ways. And this is kind of going into more like Gabor Mate stuff when he talks about how we hold that stress in our body and how it can lead to all these different illnesses, right? We know that
For
something will
sure.
happen over time. Our bodies are so incredibly strong that yes, they're capable of taking on like a moment of fight or flight, right? And that's what it's really meant to be. In a moment that our survival is being endangered in some way, then yeah,
Mhm.
going into the whole fight or flight, adrenaline, cortisol, all that glucose that circulates our body, that's totally fine. It's the aftermath of that when our body continues to respond in that way. What does that do over time, right? I
For
think that's
sure.
something that becomes so maladaptive later on.
For sure. For sure. Alex, I could talk to you for hours. I love picking your brain about the brain. I really do appreciate your time today. Is there anything you want to leave off with, or anything you want to add?
Hmm. No, this was really fun. I also enjoyed having the interview with you. So yeah, we could definitely talk about more about this off camera.
For sure.
But I think it's really an important piece talking about shame and normalizing shame because I think, shame in and of itself is such a vulnerable emotion that doesn't want to be seen. As we're talking about it more and recognizing that's something that we all hold, right? Just like any other emotion, it's okay if we kind of shine the light on it. Of course, asking that part if it's ready to be illuminated and to work through some of that stuff. But I think really just highlighting that is a fundamental part of trauma is such an important piece when it comes to trauma healing.
For sure. And no, I really appreciate you diving into that because, like I said at the beginning, I really feel like shame and guilt and, self image is so tied together. And some people, might have reactive circumstances from shame that they don't even acknowledge just because, it's become kind of par for the course. I do X, I feel terrible about it, I should, and like you said, when you start to normalize that, that's when you really create a yucky circumstance for yourself, right?
Totally, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. You can find Alex at greenpathpsychotherapy.ca. Is that right?
Yeah.
Perfect. And her team as well. Thank you again for joining us. And we hope you guys will tune in to the next episode of Breaking the Silence.